Thank you. Hello, everybody, and good evening. Today, we are facing a situation, and we are unfortunately looking at a whole people who is being exposed to a tragedy beyond comprehension. When I was asked to participate today, I wanted to speak about Ukraine refugees, first of all, also in the context of Europe, but first of all, of course, the refugees from Ukraine as we see them today. At that time, we didn't know what was actually happening and how they would be received and how they would be encountered by the international society. So I will start just quoting. No, I cannot. Oh, sorry. That's what Barbed er. Kan noen hjelpe meg? Okay. Excuse me. I'd like to speak with quoting the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who has reminded us all there's no winners in war, but countless of lives will be torn apart. We have already seen reports of casualties and people starting to flee their homes to seek safety. And I think we must say that what we're seeing today is a mass production of trauma. And I want to share with you just one little thought. Okay, so what's happening today? What's happening in the refugee situation today? And I also want to talk about this against the backdrop of the refugee situation in Europe the last 10 years. So has Europe's response to refugees changed? During the 2015 refugee crisis, the EU called for detaining arriving refugees for up to 18 months. This is fortunately not happening today. Okay, sorry. So the question is, of course, has Europe's response to refugees changed? And yes, it is changing, and it's changing very clearly, because we don't have to go any further than to 2015, where the EU very clearly said, and I will give you some examples later on, how refugees in Europe were to be received by detention up to 18 months. There are three important principles in relation to refugees and their right to asylum. First of all, there is a very clear right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that every person is entitled to apply for asylum for protection if they so need. There's also the obligation of states to provide an efficient and fair procedure to work on the asylum applications as they arrive to a country. And the third part is the one on the non-refoulement, which is a very highly valued principle in international law, namely the fact that you cannot return a person to war or especially to torture. So what are the three main avenues to protection? This topic goes through it. This is difficult. The three main avenues to protection: resettlement for refugees, that's what we call the quota refugees. There's the asylum seekers, persons seeking asylum, seeking protection in the country, and there's a temporary collective protection. Excuse me, can somebody help me? Now, what should we do? I can go without, but then I need to. Ja, så vi forventer ikke at det kommer tilbake.
Men hvis vi gjør det sånn, så kan det funke, selv om man ser slidene. Men da er det
Problemet er når det full skjerm der. Så derfor vi også hadde videoen lavere, så hvis du kan
Ja,
kjøre
det er greit for meg.
Har du
Ja, ja. Okay, I think I will start again. Or I won't start and bore you from the very beginning, but I think I want to say to you that luxury problems in relation to what we're speaking about. The three main avenues, as I mentioned, to protection and to asylum. That is, first of all, the resettlement refugees. Those are the ones that are picked out by the UNHCR, and they are placed in another country, in a safe country for a while, and then they're resettled in the country. In Norwegian, we call them kvoteflyktninger. And then we have the asylum seekers who are actively crossing the borders themselves and asking for applying for protection once they have crossed the border. And the third group is called the temporary collective protection, which exists in Norwegian law and it exists in international law, and it is used sometimes in situations where there's mass catastrophes and mass evacuations. Norway is now offering temporary collective protection to Ukrainians and is establishing more places in reception centers. And as our Prime Minister has said, we're now facing the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, and that we are following European Union's lead and offer temporary collective protection to Ukrainian citizens. This means that the displaced Ukrainians will not have to undergo the time-consuming process of having their case reviewed individually. So the temporary collective protection gives people the possibility of staying in the country for at least 1 year. Then their situation will be evaluated. They are not given any more permanent protection, as it's also said here, but there is a possibility to apply for individual asylum should they so need. The collective scheme in Norway will be coordinated with other countries in Europe. And this is a paragraph in the Norwegian foreign law on these issues. So, and the European Union has, as we said, they have taken now a historic step to protect the Ukrainian refugees, and some will be given these rights from the very beginning. This means that Europe is now very clearly defining a very positive refugee policy with regard to the thousands of people who are now arriving into Europe, also providing them with healthcare, with work, and possibilities for education. This is very good. And again, from the decision taken by the Council just some days ago, unanimously introducing temporary protection all over Europe. So what's the history about collective temporary protection in Norway? Because we have done it before. In 1992, the refugees from Bosnia-Herzegovina were welcomed to Norway for a temporary collective protection. We were a bit skeptical at the time, I remember, but it was promised as being a safe and a good venue to seek protection at a later stage. In 1995, the 3 years had passed because this is what is provided initially. And then some individual asylum applications started coming. Also, there was a revision of the situation following the Dayton Agreement in 1995, and the conclusion was that it was not safe to return, so people were allowed to stay on, and many have stayed until this very day. The same process was tried again in 1999 with people from Kosovo. As you remember, NATO bombed Kosovo. There was a high need of people to flee. Macedonia was, of course, really overwhelmed by the refugees arriving in. And Norway accepted flying in 6,000 people from Kosovo who were supposed to be under the same regulation 1 year, possibly 3. What happened in the Kosovo situation was not so good as in the Bosnian one, which also makes me a bit concerned, of course, for the situation today. Because the protection was lifted already half a year after. The same summer it was lifted. Yes, the bombing had stopped and some people returned voluntarily, but after that point, it became extremely difficult. So many Kosovo Albanians at that point applied for asylum in Norway, and many of them stayed. Some had to return to their country. So what's the situation today? We see that only these last days, altogether, there's more than 1.5 million refugees crossing borders and into these countries that you see marked on the map. But then at the same time, we have the internally displaced people, and we must expect that these groups can grow a lot. CD has already referred to the internally displaced persons, usually abbreviated IDPs. who are people who have not crossed borders and cannot call upon the same protections, international protections, as the ones who have crossed the borders can. So internationally today, we must expect that we will have that the Ukrainians will be a new group of IPs in the world. Following the Crimea situation in 2014, there was more than 1.5 internally displaced people in Ukraine. So the migration by numbers today is a total of 71 million who are currently displaced. Among these, only 26 millions have crossed borders, which means, of course, that the great majority have never crossed any borders. And of course, the dramatic thing is that half of them are under 18 years old, which really underlines the importance to mobilize with respect to children and to child support and help. But back to the IDPs. This is from 2014, but the map was so good, so I wanted to use it. I tried to compare it with a newer map, and the numbers are practically the same. As you see, Syria and Colombia up to date, these two countries together have more than 13 million internally displaced persons. It's a lot of people. This is the newer map, and you see there are many places in the world with very high numbers of IDP. So what I would speak about now is some reflections on the triple burden, psychological burden of those who are now seeking safety, protection outside of Ukraine. Because what are they struggling with? It's first of all the danger, insecurity, and separation prior to leaving. They're also leaving in a situation with hardships, because leaving, we often see when people arrive, but the way there is quite tough. And then what about the future? What other perspectives they're confronted with in the future? When we think about the agony of war, what happens before the decision of leaving the country is taken, there is the total insecurity. And we heard so well how Yuri said, it's not about how you are, but are you alive? It's the total lack of predictability, the constant fear of losing lives, anger and hopelessness, overwhelming injustice, and not being able to protect your own family, which in itself is something that's very heavy on everybody who experienced this. I think the separation that we're seeing now, families that are torn apart, the men have to be left behind, women and children are leaving, that in itself is so painful. And as it said in the New York Times today or yesterday, a story about Irina, who had been married for some years, has to say goodbye to her husband. I told him I love you and we will see each other soon. Mrs. Dakuta said, her eyes pooling. Now she says she does not know even when or even if she will ever see him again. So this is the tragedy we are listening to, hearing about every day, and that too many people are experiencing. And the flight itself is not easy. Although there are a lot of NGOs or other helping organizations helping out in different ways, but the flight in itself is tough. The conditions under the way, the climate is not the best of the situation. There's a lack of security. People have been shot with their bags in their hand. We've seen that on television already. There are differences and discriminations. We heard about the Norwegian students who had been studying in Russia. We know now about a lot of non-Ukrainian students in Ukraine who are now also fleeing with the Ukrainian people, and they are not welcome. Many places they're actually exposed to severe discrimination and reprisals, which is extremely unacceptable and very dramatic. Borders are not open to all. So what is the waiting process? What is waiting people who are moving? And will they be resettled in the third country? Will Poland be able to house all these people, or will they be resettled in the third country? And then what about the future? What does actually temporary protection mean? When does it stop? How will we be received in the host society? Will we be resettled? What are the possibilities? Will there be work for everybody, education, economy? Can we go on with bits of our lives? Will my document or certificate as a psychologist, will that count in any of these countries? Our health, our traumatic experience, who will receive, who will meet, who will deal with these? The family left in the country, the constant fear. And then I want to mention something which was very clear to me. I've had 2 telephones about this today, that all the Ukrainians living abroad who are now just looking into what's happening at home. And people are extremely stressed and extremely pressed by this. And I was asked today to ask, is there anyone at the Department of Psychology could we organize ways of helping and supporting also those who are living in our country, looking into what's happening in their country? Because it's a tremendous fear of the families and homes that are under fire. Constant searching for information. I heard that people don't sleep because they're up with their mobile every other half an hour. Are they logged on? Are they alive? Is there any sign of life at home? Always checking news day and night. Not being able to help is something that is felt as extremely dramatic. Constant bad conscience, and whatever they do, that's being in Norway, they feel they're never doing enough, on the verge of collapse, and they really, really need support and help. So the enormous challenges that beat them, we should also find ways of dealing with. So having said something about the very dramatic and very brutal situation for the Ukraine refugees today, I'd like to say a few words about the just only the 10 years of European refugee policy. Because even though if today there's a positivity and there's an openness and there's a willingness to help, I'm also afraid, given some of the situations that we have seen over the last years when it comes to receiving people from abroad. Because the so-called refugee crisis we had just as late as 2015 created high political tension and temperature and a public discourse that few thought was possible. It was about conditions in reception center becoming worsened, about temporary stays and no working permissions, active use of very early rejection before any form of asylum application had been processed whatsoever, violence at the border police, there's a lot of that, open shelters were being closed. Many countries in Europe don't have open shelters anymore, they're all closed. Closing borders, people are held in places without exit, such as the islands we've heard about. Negligence of rescue missions at sea, pushbacks of ships with refugees on, and plans about building walls. These are examples of reception conditions that we have in Europe this day. We have seen a discourse of degradation and humiliation and hate speech. We have seen an increased level of discrimination, which is a policy of deterrence. It's questioning the human rights, especially the right to asylum. As close as Denmark, the minister some years ago said, is it actually so that we have to take seriously Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a universal right to seek asylum? And this is very, very, very concerning. And also relativization of obligations. These are examples of pictures taken just during the last few years. And the fact that, to the big concern of UNHCR, global strategy beyond detention, as the report was mentioned, the detention of asylum seekers and refugees that had become the commonplace. And UNHCR has been seriously concerned about this. And I'm closing in a moment. So Hungary, for instance, in 2017, passed a law where they decided to detain all asylum seekers passing the border. I was myself visiting those camps just 2 days after this law was passed. And I can tell you, it was not nice to enter these places, speak to children, speak to families living under these conditions. So is there some hope? Yes, of course, we have to believe in hope. And as I usually say, if you're dealing with so much disaster and so much pain, one has to be optimistic to it all survive. So there is a strong engagement today on from civil society and from governments to protect people coming from Ukraine. The world is more unified than it has been for a long time. The Ukraine refugees have been welcomed, but the needs are immense. Thank you very much.